everybody to National Pollinator Week, and this is the final day of our Pollinator Power Party of 2024. This is our Mythbusters Day. This is one of the favorites of our party every year. And just as an introduction to myself and EPRI as an organization, EPRI is a nonprofit research institute with a public benefit mission, and we work on all issues related to electricity. We're 50 years old, and we're really, really proud to be a well-established independent research organization. The Pollinator Power Party is kind of born out of work that we've done for over a decade, actually, researching pollinators and doing work on technical work. And you're welcome to visit our website to see some of that technical work. And then born during the COVID pandemic, when we were all closed down and there was social distancing. We converted local pollinator activities led by electric power companies across North America into this one large virtual party. So this party is really one of the outcomes of the COVID shutdown. And now it's become the world's largest virtual party celebrating pollinators. So last year we reached over 2 million people. We don't know who we're going to reach this year, and we really appreciate everybody joining. So the goal of the party is really to increase awareness about pollinators, make sure folks have access to accurate information and science, because pollinators is becoming an increasingly popular topic, and we just want to make sure everybody has information, that we answer questions, and that's kind of the purpose of the party, and particularly of today of Mythbusters. So what we kind of say is that we bring this information to your living rooms, your classrooms, and your boardrooms. And we're really grateful for one of our specific initiatives at EPRI. It's called the EPRI Power and Pollinator Initiatives. That is the backstop to this party. It's a collaboration of about 30 electric companies that pool money to advance research that benefits the public, and the party is one of those. So thank you to the EPRI Power and Pollinator Initiative, and also to the sponsors of the party. Okay, so this year we ran a live stream on YouTube on Monday that was talking about the business case for pollinators and sort of how to balance pollinators and biodiversity during this time of so many other challenges, including water, climate, and something EPRI thinks a lot about is this renewable energy transition and how we're going to meet renewable energy goals, while we're also thinking about things like social equity and environmental justice. And specifically for some of our researchers, it's thinking about pollinators. So if you missed a live stream on Monday, check it out. It's really neat. We have some world-class executives that had a podcast with us to talk about how to balance those things. And then on Tuesday was our community gardening and engagement day. That day is super fun. We went into classrooms and we heard from folks really getting things done on the day-to-day basis and give you tips for gardenings. And on our website, just to remind folks that we post free resources. So I'm going to show you a couple of them. One of them is this thing called a BID guide. That's a really neat resource to kind of help you when you see bees out there, think about what type of bee is it. So if you're kind of just getting started, and honestly, I have this BID guide with me a lot. It helps me as well. And, you know, I look at bees a lot. And then also on our website are things like learn how to do origami folding of pollinators. We have videos that show you how to fold butterflies, and I think we have a bat and a cicadid. So there's actual videos, lessons on this, as well as music and art. So check out the website when you have a few minutes. It's all free. Use it in your classrooms, or sometimes we even use it at EPRI as sort of, you know, breathers between other technical meetings. So that's kind of the setup for today. So we're super excited to be joined today by several EPRI offices. One of our employee engagement events this year, we use our Pollinator Party to engage our own employees. So hey guys, shout out to all the EPRI offices. We have offices in Dallas, Lenox, Knoxville, Palo Alto, Charlotte. Thanks for joining the party. Yay for EPRI, you guys are awesome. Put your questions in the chat, as well as everybody that's public on this webcast with us. All right. Okay, Hannah, so let's get rolling with the main show for today, which is our live Mythbuster panel. And we have been receiving questions through our email box and our social media about what are common myths related to pollinators. So I'll introduce myself and then we'll do a roundtable introduction of our Mythbusters. And Hannah, looks like we're missing Lora right now. If we could get her up on the stage. There we go. Perfect. Um, so just for my introducing myself, I'll kick it off. My name is Jessica Fox. I've been at UPRI for 22 years. I'm a trained conservation biologist, and I lead work related to corporate sustainability, water sustainability, and biodiversity, and then have a specialty area in pollinators and bees and monarch butterflies. So Kristen, I'll pass it to you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Kristen Lear. I work at Bat Conservation International. We are a nonprofit working around the world to end bat extinctions. I've been a bat conservationist for a little over 15 years now, working around the world on different bat species. But my current work and my PhD work previously focused on pollinating bats in the Southwest US and Mexico. And at BCI, I lead our agave restoration initiative to restore agave plants for these threatened and endangered pollinating bats, as well as support community livelihoods.
And Kristen, you're also a National Geographic Explorer.
Yep, received a grant from Nat Geo several years ago to support my work with bats. And yeah, I do a lot of work with outreach and education, particularly with women and girls in STEM.
Great, awesome. Lora.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name's Lora Morandin, and I'm the Associate Director at Pollinator Partnership. So our mission is to protect all pollinators and their ecosystems. And I'm really excited to be here with you during Pollinator Week. This was initiated by Pollinator Partnership back in 2007. And we're also honored to be co-hosting the Pollinator Power Party with UPRI. So I'm speaking to you from my home in Victoria, British Columbia. These are the unceded territories of the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nations. And they've been stewarding this land for thousands of years, and that continues to this day. So I'm quite honored to be able to work on these lands and through my work and through my life. Great. So I've done research for about 25 years now. I study mostly native bees and beneficial insects. I've done research at various universities. I have a PhD and did postdoc work. I'm a National Geographic Explorer as well. I've written and contributed to about 40 different peer-reviewed publications and have co-authored books and book chapters. And what I'm really passionate about is finding ways that we can create and foster landscapes where humans and nature can coexist and even thrive. So I'm really happy to be here today and talk to you about pollinators.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Laura. Aaron.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here with you all today. And yeah, thank you to Jessica and UPRI for having us. My name is Aaron Anderson, and I work on the pesticide reduction team at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, we're a nonprofit that's been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. It lived in the coastal sand dune area around San Francisco. For my role at Xerces, I mainly work in residential landscapes, doing outreach and education on pesticide reduction, pollinator-friendly gardening practices, and alternative pest management as well. And I have a background in urban pollinator conservation, which is what I studied for my PhD dissertation. And I've previously done work in insect biocontrol and kind of general ecological restoration as well. And yeah, actually similar to what Laura was saying, I'm really passionate about kind of increasing ecological function, particularly for pollinators and other invertebrates in kind of our residential landscapes where we live and we work and we play. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about that today.
All right, awesome. Thank you. It's an incredible panel. And I think you can hear kind of from the introductions that collectively we can try to answer your toughest myths about pollinators and butterflies and bats and what you can do in your own garden. Okay, so we've received a whole set of questions, so I'm going to kick it off, and then you're welcome to chat. You can put questions in this chat in the WebEx. That's why we're hosting this via WebEx. So it's really a live interactive session, and I have a couple people that are going to moderate the chat and send me questions to put on the table for the panelists. So to kick this off, is the decline in pollinators really an issue? Are pollinators really declining around the world? And why is this really such a big deal? Laura.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I'll jump into that one. So the short answer is yes. Pollinators are declining, and this is a big issue, but there are some nuances to this for sure. So one of the big things is that it's really hard to know what's going on with pollinator populations because we don't have these long-term studies that are standardized and go back many years so that we can then compare to what we have today. So as researchers, what we do is we look at museum specimens and collections from the past and try to compare it to the current situation. And what we can say definitively is that we know that the occupancy or the ranges of some pollinators are definitely shrinking. Others are staying pretty stable maybe, and some others are even increasing. But for the most part, when we look at native bees and other pollinators as a whole, we see that there is a trend to many of them declining. And overall, when we look at them, many are declining. So there are some nuances in it, but we know that this is happening and that we should be concerned about it. And the reason that we should be concerned about it is because you might have heard this before, but about 1 in every 3 bites of our food is a direct result of pollinators. So personally, for us, that's super important. And it does tend to be the healthy stuff in our diet, those colorful fruits and vegetables. The other thing is that they're keystone to our ecosystem. So they pollinate all these plants, about 90-ish% of our flowering plants that we need in our ecosystems to support all our other wildlife. So they are quite keystone. So it's quite concerning that we do see some declines where we do have enough information to look at that. And we know that some species have been extirpated. That means they're gone from certain regions. And some have even gone extinct. That means they're totally gone.
Mm-hmm. And so, Kristen, what about bats? Are bats, I mean, we're talking bees, and the three of us focus on bees and butterflies, but what do you think about bats, and are bats having issues?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. I mean, I think bats in general are kind of the unknown pollinators. They're the ones the lesser known pollinators, but bat species around the world, about 8% of the 1,400 plus species around the world pollinate plants. And they pollinate over 300 plants around the world, including wild flowers, wild plants, as well as commercially important plants like durian, which are really important food sources in some parts of the world. And of course, what I work with, agave plants, which we use to make tequila, mezcal, and other uses, particularly in Mexico. And so, yeah, we're seeing, just like with insect pollinators, we are seeing population declines of these pollinating bat species because of habitat loss, roost disturbance, where they're roosting at night, just lots of different threats, and unfortunately having an impact on the environment as well.
And there is a bat that, well, there's a couple bats, but there is at least one that got uplisted on the Endangered Species Act recently. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are mostly the insectivorous bats, but yes, they are. I mean, we're getting bats being listed, unfortunately, at an alarming rate, just because of, like I said, those habitat loss, white nose syndrome, wind turbines are a big thing for some species. So they're kind of getting hit by all angles.
So in that case, some of the renewable build out could be impacting bat populations.
Yeah, so there's but there's work, trying to work with companies to mitigate some of those impacts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then just wanted to hit on this topic of monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly is one of the species that's being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act. and Fish and Wildlife. It's anticipated that Fish and Wildlife will make a determination about that by December of 2024. And those both the overwintering habitat in Mexico and the overwintering habitat on the West Coast continue to show declines in the population of monarchs across both in the United States and internationally. Do you guys have any further thoughts or comments specifically about monarch butterflies and their declining populations?
Not in particular, I don't really work on monarchs, but I will chime in and say that I think that they really do kind of serve as this kind of figurehead species for, a lot of issues that are impacting all sorts of pollinators, from habitat loss and fragmentation to pesticide use. It's, I think, something that is a really great thing to rally behind, just because a lot of the things that we can do to help protect monarch populations are also going to be beneficial to a wide variety of other invertebrates and pollinators.
Okay, well, let's talk about this pesticide thing a little bit, because there's a lot of questions coming in about appropriate or inappropriate use of pesticides and neonicotinoids and glyphosate and kind of this whole group of this topic about pesticides and how that relates to habitat. So a question came in from Shelley in San Francisco. My neighbor, I keep finding bees dead in my garden, in my pollinator garden in my yard. Could that be caused by my neighbor who sprays their garden with pesticides? Thoughts about that, Aaron? Let's
Sure, that's a really good question. And unfortunately, this could be a reason that, Shelley's finding dead bees in her garden. But I should note that there are many other reasons that you might find dead bees from pathogens, so just natural deaths, since bee lifespans tend to be pretty short. But neighbors using pesticides, especially if you do know your neighbor is using pesticides, is, a very real risk. Many insecticides used in conventional garden and kind of park pest management are highly toxic and can kill bees and all sorts of other pollinators. Some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects that they impact, but many tend to be really broad. So they'll kill the pest insect, but also everything else in your yard, which means they can also kill beneficial insects like predators and parasitoids that are helping keep pests in check, which can then lead to worse pest problems down the road, unfortunately. And modern insecticides are really potent, and the newer ones, Jessica, you just mentioned neonicotinoids or neonics, aren't more friendly to bees and are actually more concerning in many ways. And I think for this specific question, I have a couple suggestions. One, even though this sounds kind of simple, is if you have a good relationship with your neighbor, try to talk to them and ask them not to spray. And, we kind of encourage you to, obviously not be accusatory and try to kind of understand their motivations or where they're coming from, because people have lots of different reasons they might be using pesticides, or they might not be aware, because there is a lot of marketing that kind of makes people think some of these products are safe for bees and other insects, when that's not necessarily the case. And then you can also kind of better share information that might help convince them, as well as kind of share your values and why you garden the way you do and you're creating this pollinator habitat. If that doesn't work, or you don't feel comfortable talking to your neighbor, one suggestion is to try to plant a kind of a drift barrier, is what it's called, to protect your habitat and the pollinators in your yard, using something like an arborvitae or kind of, a non-flowering shrub is a good way to kind of stop some of that pesticide drift from your neighbor's yard. You obviously want it to be a non-flowering shrub, because you don't want to be attracting pollinators that are then going to be hit by that pesticide. So that's one idea. You can obviously also try to set your pollinator habitat back a little bit from that neighbor who's spraying. So those are just kind of some thoughts on that question from Shelley's.
Well, what about organic pesticides? There's this question, are organic pesticides safe for bees or bats? Or butterflies? I never even heard of organic pesticides. Is that a thing?
That's a great, organic pesticides are those that are generally used in organic production, and organic standards are, a really strong and a valuable system that we support. But just because a pesticide is organic doesn't mean that it's non-toxic or that it doesn't present risk to pollinators. Even organic ones that are derived from natural sources are still designed to kill insects, which means beneficial insects like pollinators will still be at risk from these these products. I will say, though, that organic pesticides tend to be less toxic and much less persistent, which means they break down in the environment a lot faster than conventional insecticides or pesticides do, but they can still be quite toxic. So just because something's organic doesn't mean that it's safe to just kind of spray willy-nilly. You still may be impacting pollinators and other beneficial insects in your yard.
So, Kristen, what about for bats? How are these things interacting with bats?
Yeah, I mean, basically, Erin, covered a lot of the insect aspect. And in terms of most of the bats that we have around like the US, for the most part, are insectivorous bats. So they're eating those insects. And so, the concern is that if those bats are eating insects that have some of those pesticide residues on them, then the bats will be ingesting those into their system. And we have seen that, around the world where there's insecticide residues in bat guano, in the milk of the mother bats that they feed to their babies. It is this systemic thing that can be found in bats, and we don't know really the long-term impacts of that. It doesn't usually, outright kill the bats, but it might have long-term reproductive effects, health effects. And so it is a concern. So that's why, if we can do non-spraying, more of the kind of holistic approach to gardening, if you have a garden, instead of spraying, that would be ideal. And then, any of the pollinating bats, of course, if you have agave plants, for example, they'll be drinking the nectar, but usually you don't really spray agaves like in your garden for the most part. So shouldn't be too much of a concern.
Well, actually, that was a question from Gary B. Do bats only eat flying insects, or do some bat species eat insects picked off the flowers, plants, and fruit? And could they be eating those that have been then sprayed or carrying pesticides?
Yeah, so yes, there are bats that are gleaners. So they'll glean, like you said, insects off of foliage or off of flowers or off the ground. So yes, that definitely, the bats, even if they're not pollinating bats or nectar feeding bats, can still come into contact with those flowers. I've seen insectivorous bats like throwing themselves onto agave flowers, partly maybe to get nectar, but it looks like they've been hunting moths that are on the agave flowers. Mm-hmm. So yes, definitely can happen.
So bats are mammals. They have, right? So they have moms, pups. The pups nurse from the moms, right? Mm-hmm. So, and we are mammals.
Yep.
Right? So there's a little bit closer connection. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Wow. Laura, do you have thoughts on this? I was thinking of, the other questions are sort of switching to, okay, so now what can we do to manage either, invasive plant species or insects, thinking about either use of ladybugs. You see these ladybugs being sold in garden centers. And I've also heard from some folks in Europe, they use vinegar, so either putting vinegar on it on weeds and things like that. Do you have thoughts on use of? Is that appropriate to buy ladybugs and release them into your environment, or is that just translocating different species where they shouldn't be?
Well, I think just going back for a second to the pesticides and using pesticides and echoing everything that Erin and Kristen said about that. And, for smaller scale gardens, we probably don't need to use pesticides. We can create a bit more of an ecosystem. For larger scale agriculture, sometimes it's needed, whether that's organic or conventional agriculture. But whether you're using them in your garden or larger scale, I really encourage people to read the labels, because it will have toxicity information for bees and then mitigation that you need to do before you apply these pesticides. So first, I think that's super important to be checking out those labels if you do decide that you need to use pesticides. And then in terms of other alternatives, there's so many alternatives, which kind of gets fun because you can start exploring some of these differences. And one of them that I saw recently was, in your patio stones and things, if you get weeds coming up, instead of using a herbicide, you can get a kettle of boiling water and pour it over the weeds. And I thought that, what a great idea. Be careful that you don't splash it on yourself and don't get it in your plants that you want. But I thought that was a great alternative. So I think there's a lot of alternatives online that we can look into. In terms of bringing in beneficial insects and purchasing insects, I would want to be careful that they're native insects to the region. So there's a lot of different types of lady beetles, ladybugs, and we want to not disrupt the ecosystems more than we already have. We don't know all the cascading effects of what's going to happen as we bring organisms in. We should have learned our lessons by now, I think, on these things. So I do encourage people to think more about how you can create an ecosystem and how you can really get those natural predatory insects and parasitoid insects that are going to control the pests by creating an ecosystem with native plants. So, for example, in my front yard, I noticed about a couple of weeks ago that my yarrow, which is a native plant here, was just covered in aphids. And my thought was, great, I'm going to start seeing lady beetles and flower flies soon. And that's exactly what happened. And the aphids are almost gone from the yarrow now, and I'm seeing those beneficial insects. So it's a lot like that. If you build it, they will come. And we're here, our organizations are here to help you build it properly so that you'll get those good ecosystems.
Okay, so let's kind of switch. So this is Sheila in California. She said, "I'm just a home gardener. You know, what can I really do in my home garden that's a small space?" And just asking, you know, what are some basic tips of about what she should plant and how she should manage that, even though she can't control all of her neighbors. Should she even put in a garden that has nectar and floral species in it or not, or just say, I can't manage my gardener who sprays pesticides, so I'm not doing anything?
I guess I'll jump in. The answer is yes. The great news is that pollinators and all sorts of other invertebrates can really use these small habitat patches and kind of partial habitats like yards and parks. And improvements to these habitats that we have at home can really have dramatic results. So yeah, I want to emphasize you really can make a difference at home. You can plant habitat, create nesting resources, stop using pesticides. And then I think a really important thing too is doing education and outreach to your friends and neighbors. Talk about what you're doing. Talk about why it's important, because one yard providing great habitat for pollinators is really good and wonderful. But as more and more houses in a block and in a neighborhood and in a city are providing habitat, it's just going to scale up and provide more habitat and more connected habitat. So yeah, the quick answer to the question is yes. Definitely plant these pollinator habitats in your yard.
So specifically those pollinator habitats, to just give some practical tips, like if people are going out and they're all inspired, after pollinator week, I'm going to do something. Select plant species that are native to your region, right? So do a little bit of research and and get educated a little bit about it before you go to the nursery and pick your plants and see. I see plants at my nursery all the time. I live in California. California is a pretty big state. I mean, you can be native to Southern California and not native to Northern California where the redwoods are, right? So the conversation about what is native is we see it on a technical level as an evolving conversation. What do we mean when we say a person is native or a plant is native, right? So do a little bit of research on that. There are a number of resources out there for you across the United States. Pollinator Partnership has resources. Xerces has resources. So check out those websites maybe as you're planning your garden. And of course, there's local native plant societies all over the US. So that's like the key tip is pick your native species. And do research. I've learned not to trust the labels at the nursery. Actually, my son is doing a senior project in high school. He's so frustrated when we go to the nurseries and it says native. He's like, that's not native. So he's doing his senior thesis about this thing. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I wanted to chime in on from the bat angle. Like I said, around the US, Canada, most of us don't have pollinating bats. There's only parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and a tiny bit of very, very Southern California that get pollinating bats. But for all the other folks that want to have a garden, if you plant native night blooming flowers, you can help support the insectivorous bats that eat those insects that will be feeding on those night blooming flowers. So yeah, I would encourage people to not forget about the nocturnal animals and to include night blooming flowers if you can in your garden. And then another tip for bats in terms of gardening is to, if you can, don't have bright lights like porch lights. Obviously, street lights you can't control, but those bright lights at night can impact bat foraging and scare some bats away. So yeah, keep your garden kind of unlit at night with those night blooming flowers. And Bat Conservation International, we have a Gardening for Bats informational brochure. So if you go to our website, batcon.org, you can find that Gardening for Bats information for more details.
And that night, there's this whole topic about light pollution, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
those bright lights at night that you know, maybe you put a light because it looks pretty, it's uplighting your big oak tree or redwood tree or whatever. Actually, it impacts bats and owls and all these species that are trying to live and forage during the night, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we encourage the low light or no light if possible.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's
Thanks for-
talk about, oh, go ahead, Aaron.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up, Kristen, because this isn't pollinators per se, but at Xerces we have a firefly program, and that's one of the things they talk about as well as the impact that light pollution has on firefly population. So yeah, that's a really great consideration.
Right. Okay. So let's hit, while we're talking about selecting species to put, plant species to put in your garden, let's talk about hit monarch and milkweed again. This question has come up repeatedly during Mythbusters this year. Milkweed and monarchs and tropical milkweed. This is something I've done a little bit of work on, is the use of tropical milkweed. If you're planting tropical milkweed in areas that are not tropical, that's there's quite a bit of debate about whether that's beneficial for monarchs or not. In general, using this sort of precautionary principle and select your native milkweeds to your region. So there's not just one species of milkweed, they're milkweeds, plural, and look up what the native milkweed is to your region and use that. Tropical milkweed is kind of the orange, yellow, really showy. It's really pretty, right? But it's not native to my region or most of the United States. So that's one piece. And I know Xerces did a study where they tested through nurseries where they purchased plants that were labeled as pollinator friendly. They tested them for pesticides and found a high rate of pesticides in nursery sold plants that said they were for pollinators. Aaron, do you have comments about that from Xerces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's definitely something. There's a couple places we like to talk about there being these hidden risks for pesticide exposure in the home yard, and one of them is potentially plants purchased from nurseries. Like you were saying, Jessica, we did this study a few years ago with partners where we sampled milkweeds at nurseries across the country and found pretty high levels of contamination on milkweeds, even on milkweeds that were labeled bee friendly or kind of neonic free. So it's definitely something we're really working on, and it's something that we really encourage you when you're selecting plants for your pollinator garden is to take steps when you're buying, ask for organic plants. Try to avoid these plants that are treated with these long-lived, toxic, highly systemic. So that means the pesticides expressed all the way through the plants and all of its tissues. And yeah, try to get to know nursery practices. And I know this can be really hard because lots of times nurseries don't even know where the plants that they were purchased, how they were actually grown. But even if your local nursery doesn't know the answer, it will demonstrate consumer demand for bee-safe plants. And we have some resources on our website. We have buying bee safe plants, and I think it's providing or selling bee safe plants with more details. But if you're purchasing plants and you don't know whether the plant you bought was grown in a pollinator friendly manner, you can assume it might be contaminated. And there are some actions you can take to kind of limit harm. If you assume the soil your plant comes in is contaminated, you can dump that soil so the plant doesn't continue taking up more pesticides from it once you've planted it in your yard. And you could also net the plant with like a fine mesh to prevent pollinators from visiting that first year. Plants can have pretty high concentrations of pesticides in the leaves, pollen, and nectar, but those will subside over time. So those are just a couple tips, that might be helpful.
All right, let's talk about some safety questions. This comes up a lot. So two main safety questions. We'll start with the bats first. Kristen, do bats bite? And are we at risk if we support if we put native plants and all that, and we get all these bats flying around while we're having, our nighttime party?
Yeah,
that idea.
Good question. They have teeth, they have mouths, they can bite just like we can, just like any animal can. But they are just like any other animal, they're not out to get you. They are not out, hunting or people, they don't attack people. So yeah, we can absolutely 100% coexist, have bats in our yard. I have bats flying in my yard. I have a little pond and they swoop down to drink water. 100% we can do that. It's just kind of the common sense things. If, for example, if you find a bat on the ground, it's more likely to be sick or injured than a bat just flying around. So, don't touch it with your bare hands, use gloves and a box and call your local either natural resource department or a local rehabber. So, those types of things, but 100% we can all enjoy the spaces together.
Okay. And Kristen, you did a Mythbuster that ran on our Tuesday session about bat boxes and whether or not, if we see these bat boxes, we see butterfly houses and bird houses like at our local stores, and you busted some myths about the bat boxes that look really cool, like at the hardware store, but I sent you pictures. I was like, hey, is this legit? We got to bust a myth. So if you missed that, go back and look at the Tuesday video of it that's posted to YouTube. Kristen hits this, but finally busts the myths about built bat boxes.
Yeah.
And butterfly houses. So let's hit butterfly house. What if somebody's going to the hardware store and they see a butterfly house? Laura, what do you think about these really nice looking butterfly houses that we see at stores? Should we buy those and put them up in our yard? And is that helping?
I think if you want some decoration, they can look pretty cute and nice. From everything that I've seen and the research I've been associated with, butterflies are not using bees. That's not the resources that they need to be in the environment. It's kind of a similar thing with the bee houses as well. So bee houses can be a great educational thing, but 90-something% of the ones sold at stores are not done properly, where you can't clean them out. So as soon as you start putting up habitat for something like a bat or a bee or a butterfly, you're in some ways becoming a farmer, and you're putting these organisms into an unnatural environment, as cute as it looks. So then you need to take on that responsibility of cleaning them and making sure that they're not building up parasites and spreading things to the ones that are living more wild, because you are putting them in a somewhat unnatural environment. So we've got a video on bee houses and how to do it right and what they're for and what they're not for, if you'd like to check that out. But yeah, they're great for education. The butterfly houses, I'm not even sure they support butterflies really, from what I've seen.
Okay, great. Okay, so just wanted to, I have another safety comment question actually, but on this conversation that we had about like how to establish these habitats and use of pesticides, herbicides, all of those things. Some of the answers may be different depending on your scale. And Laura kind of hit on this a little bit too, is if you're working at scale. So EPRI we do projects, and you guys all do projects too, that are larger at scale. you know, they could be 100 acres or 200 acres or something like that. And when you're trying to restore habitat at those scales, sometimes, you know, even through restoration ecology principles, there can be an appropriate place to use certain mechanisms, tilling, specific herbicides used thoughtfully and at the right rate, right time, and right use, right? So just kind of, you know, saying my home garden, I don't use any chemicals. But when I'm working on restoration projects, sometimes we have to consider even fire regimes, you know, using fire to manage and try to get things down. So just kind of putting that out there because I know we have a really large audience of people that manage huge landscapes and others that are just home gardeners. So some of these answers on some of the answers, it's not always right or wrong. The question from us as like scientists is like, well, the answer depends on where you are in your situation. You know, is tropical milkweed good or bad? Well, if you live in the tropics, it's probably okay because it's native to that region. If you don't live in the tropics, you know, you probably want to pick the native milkweed, right? So, so just kind of sharing some thoughts. Okay, so safety, bees, stinging bees. Is it safe to put pollinator garden in? Because a bee sting is OSHA reportable. It's a legit OSHA reportable incident. Or, you know, maybe my kids are going to have friends over and the kid gets stung by a bee and the parents get all mad and upset. So what do we do? What's the reality around bees stinging? And is that a safety problem that we need to think about in restoring pollinator habitat?
I think first we need to understand the difference between wasps and bees. So a lot of times wasps will be around us, and my kids always got frustrated with this at school because they know how to ID all this stuff. Wasps, a lot of the bigger wasps are going after food, and they're going to be around those garbage cans, around your picnic, and some of them, many of the species are invasive here, and they can be quite a nuisance. But knowing the difference with bees and wasps is kind of the first step there, because the bees that we're attracting when we create this type of habitat are mostly the solitary bees. And what I mean by solitary is they're not in these big hives like we think of the European honeybee. They're in hives of 20 to 40,000 individuals. A lot of the females are workers and they're sterile. They can't reproduce. They sting you and they die. Whereas with these native bees that we're mostly attracting, and all the other great pollinators and beneficial insects that we're attracting with these gardens, they're not defending colonies. Each native bee, for the most part, is her own queen. So they do have stingers, the females anyways, not the males. They do have stingers, but they're doing their own things on the plants. They're not trying to come at you and protect anything. They go into their little holes in the ground or the stems. I've been working 25, almost 30 years now in the field on bees. I've never once been stung by a bee, a native bee in the field. In the lab, when I'm manipulating their colonies and stuff like that, you know, fair enough, you stung me, but not in the field. Another little part I just want to touch on quickly here is the allergy thing. And allergies are quite specific with insect venom. So I have never heard of anybody being allergic to a native bee other than a bumblebee, and that's only researchers when we were working in the lab on them. A few developed an allergy to bumblebees. Honeybees, definitely, some people have an allergy to those, the managed honeybees. But in terms of native bees, I have never heard of the solitary native bees, never heard of an allergy to that. I'm allergic to yellow jackets and not to the other bees. I've done all the tests, not to bees. So yeah, just you're creating a situation where you're bringing in these docile solitary bees and butterflies and moths and flower flies, and they're not a dangerous space.
Okay.
Yeah,
Erin,
Laura. Okay.
go ahead. I was
Oh,
going
sorry,
to.
just jumping in. I was just going to totally echo what Laura was saying and saying that, you know, in over a decade of research, I've also never been stung by a bee, you know, doing a native bee doing research in the field. And the only time that I've been stung by a bee in the last decade was playing volleyball in a field where I stepped on a honeybee that was foraging, you know, on a clover in turf. So, you know, it just goes to show that, you know, it might not be where you expect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in general, okay, so to summarize, so you said, Laura, a couple things. The females sting, the males don't sting, because the stinger is the modified, it's called a modified ovipositor, which is used for the female to lay and distribute eggs, right? That's why the male doesn't have a stinger, is because they're not laying eggs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's only the females that have this modified ovipositor because they developed from wasps that had this. And so half of the bees out there anyways can't sting, all the males. Some native bees even have the stingers so reduced that they can't penetrate human skin. And there's some that are so reduced they're called stingless bees in southern US and Central and South America. So it's just not something we need to worry about as we see when we're out and doing these things. Yeah, things can happen. Sometimes you might step on a bumblebee or a honeybee or something, and it could happen. But by creating these places, we're not increasing that risk because of what we're attracting. An interesting thing too that a lot of people don't know is that honeybees have a barbed stinger.
Mm-hmm.
So when they sting you, they die. The females are not reproductive. They go out, they sting. If they do sting you, if they're feeling threatened, they're not coming after you or anything. But if they feel threatened for some reason, they sting you. The barbed stinger will stay in you and it kind of tears out their intestines and they die. Whereas native bees, they have a straight stinger. So if they were inclined, they could sting you over and over. They don't, it doesn't pull out of them. Each one is more valuable because she's a reproductive, she's a queen, so they don't die. But again, very unlikely you're going to get stung by a native bee.
Okay. Well, I just want to hit on a final point and then we'll kind of do our closing thoughts for the Mythbusters this year. Is there's this kind of growing like recognition. We just started going down the honeybee rabbit hole a little bit, where there's this growing kind of national conversation about honeybees, which are not native to the United States. And it's sort of like versus, native wild bees. And that's a whole big conversation. We could probably spend a half an hour on this thing about, native wild bees versus the European honeybee. And on some of the project sites like that EPRI works on and other sites, I see people doing social media posts that say, I just learned about pollinators. I'm really worried. So I'm going to put a bee box in my backyard or on my property at my ranch because, this is the right thing to do, to put a bee box, which is probably a honeybee box, the Apis mellifera. So can we talk about this just for a minute, just a couple minutes about what is this issue between this honeybee and wild bees, and are honeybees having a negative impact on not, or can we support all of them, native or not, at the same time? Laura, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah, and I think we want to. I think first off, we want to stop with the dichotomy of us versus them, and it's honeybees versus native bees. Honeybees have been here for about 400 years now. Their populations were much higher in the past. They peaked at about 5.9 million, I think, in the US in the 1940s or 50s, and they've actually declined since then due to mostly economic factors. But when we create habitat, what we can do is support all the different types of pollinators that we have. And the reason that honeybees are important in addition to our native bees is that we have these huge crop areas. So we have these what we call mass blooming crops that bloom on hundreds of acres sometimes, and they bloom for maybe a couple weeks or a week. And without these boxes of honeybees that we can move to these locations, we wouldn't be getting sufficient pollination on these agricultural plots. So in terms of that, we need to support honeybees, the research on them. We want healthy populations, poor beekeepers that are trying really hard to keep up the populations of bees. But at the same time, we need to recognize that we have these native bees too, and honeybees and native bees might have different places where we want to think about them and support them. So when we have places where we've got native bees that might be at risk, those are places where we probably want to be cautious about putting in honeybees because they're using similar resources potentially. So there's a lot to think about as scientists. I know we always say that it's complicated, but it is complicated and there's nuances to it. But we like to always talk about going back to creating habitat so we have healthy populations of all our pollinators.
Okay, great. All right. Well, let's kind of wrap up for today. And we really appreciate everybody joining. And just for final thoughts from us to share and really welcome others to share their thoughts. Using our hashtag Power and Pollinators is a great way to kind of get in the long-term conversation now and throughout the year. So the question is, if if there's something that we all would like the listeners to remember from today, what would that be? And I'll start with one thought is that I think we care about what we know about, and being aware of more things and diversity of species or people, we tend to start to learn more and start to care about it. So that's one of the goals, of our Pollinator Power Party. And I would like to sort of see an evolving consideration of what beauty means and what beauty is, either in our gardens or in people and ourselves, and start to think beyond just a really classic, mowed turf grass with a white picket fence. Maybe there's another form of beauty that we can start to look at as we look at ourselves as different types of people, as well as native habitats that can be restored across the landscape. So that's what I would like. Kristen?
Yeah, I think mine piggybacks on yours perfectly. Don't forget our nocturnal friends. Pollinating bats tend to get forgotten in the conversation a lot of times, as well as just insectivorous bats that are out there. These bats are doing such important work for pollination, for insect pest control in our gardens. Just don't forget them if you can. If you're gardening, again, garden for bats. If you're doing habitat restoration, think about what bats need in terms of roosting, water, foraging habitat, and try to incorporate them into your plans because they often get the short shaft. So please don't forget them.
Okay, Laura?
A great takeaway is that we are part of the ecosystem. And I think some cultures and some people maybe have drifted away from that. And I think we need to come back to a place where we're understanding that humans are part of the ecosystem. We can't annihilate the ecosystem. We don't want to sterilize the ecosystem. We need to learn to live in it because we are part of it. And that we can all make a difference for pollinators, I think, is sort of the second part of that. As Erin said, we've got research showing the smallest amount of habitat, medium-sized, large habitat, it's all helpful for pollinators. So it really can be something that people can help with.
Great. And Erin?
Yeah, echoing what Laura just said is that we really can make a difference, at home in our communities by creating and planting habitat, which I think is really exciting. And I think my other main takeaway is that most insects aren't pests. Only about 2% of insect species are what we might consider pests, and the rest are either beneficial to us. Think pollinators or pest predators, or they're otherwise fundamental to ecosystems. So when you see an insect in your yard, it's probably doing something beneficial. So I encourage you to all just stop, look closely at what's crawling and flying in your yard, or in your park, or if you're working out in the field. Insects are so beautiful, they're so cool, and they do such great things. So I think taking that step to kind of stop and kind of learn more about them and just appreciate them is a real good takeaway.
Great. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Mythbusters. That was awesome. You guys are amazing. So let's close out the Pollinator Power Party 2024 this year. This is a wrap for our party. Be sure to watch the things posted on YouTube. The number of watches we get helps to understand our reach and therefore continue to fund this free and public party next year. And be sure to use our hashtag Power and Pollinators all year long. Tell us what you're doing. If this inspired you, or if it didn't, or if you have suggestions, we're really open to that. And we are running our first National Pollinator Bio Blitz this year. Check it out on our website. It runs through July 31st, and you can win $100 if you're one of the top observers in the Bio Blitz. So shout out to everybody. I hope everybody is well and happy and safe. And thank you for joining the party this year. And we will see you in 2025. That's a wrap.